It was 12 minutes past midnight when I nearly sent £38,000 to a woman I had never met. Rain tapped steadily against the conservatory roof, and the kitchen felt colder than it should have done. I was sitting at the table in my dressing gown, with a mug of tea beside me that I hadn't touched. My mobile lay flat near my right hand. On the screen was Eleanor's message. David, this is the last thing I will ever ask of you. After tomorrow, we can finally be together. Below it were the bank details. £38,000. She said the money would release an inheritance trapped in a legal dispute over her late sister's estate. Once the funds were cleared, she would repay me within 5 working days. Then she would come home. That was how she put it. I will come home to you. I had already entered the amount into my banking app. The account number, the sort code, the reference the solicitor had supposedly instructed her to use. All that remained was to press confirm. For 9 months, Eleanor had been the first person I heard from every morning and the last person I spoke to at night. She knew I took my tea with a little milk and no sugar. She remembered the date Margaret died. She knew the name of the hospital ward where my wife had spent her final days. Ward 31. I had only mentioned it once. Eleanor remembered. That mattered to me more than I can properly explain. Since losing Margaret 3 years earlier, most people had been kind but careful. They asked how I was coping, then seemed relieved when I said I was managing. Eleanor never hurried me. She listened. She made silence feel less empty. And now, according to her, one final payment stood between us and the life we had planned. My finger hovered over the button. Then I read the message again. This time, one word seemed to lift from the screen. Daniel. I blinked. At the end of the message, beneath the promise that we would finally be together, she had written, "Please trust me. Daniel." I read it 3 times. My name is David. She had never made that mistake before. Not once. I told myself it was exhaustion. She had been under terrible strain. Her sister's death. The solicitors. The frozen inheritance. The threat of legal action. Anyone could type the wrong name. Still, my hand moved away from the phone. A photograph sat above the message. Eleanor had sent it that morning, saying she was standing outside a solicitor's office in Manchester. She wore a navy coat and a pale blue scarf. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, and she was smiling in the calm, reassuring way that had first drawn me to her. I enlarged the image. Behind her was a glass entrance. A banner stood just inside the building, partly visible through the reflection. At first, I could only make out a few letters. I increased the brightness. Then I zoomed in again. It was the name of a nursing charity. There was also a date printed beneath it. 7 years earlier. I stared at the screen until my eyes began to ache. The picture had not been taken that morning. Perhaps it had not been taken in Manchester at all. For the first time in 9 months, I allowed a thought into my mind that I had pushed away whenever my children raised concerns. Perhaps Eleanor had not made a simple mistake. Perhaps Daniel was another man, another widower, another person receiving the same morning messages, the same promises, and the same carefully chosen words. I looked again at the smiling woman in the photograph. I had believed she understood me better than anyone since Margaret died. But suddenly I was no longer asking whether Eleanor loved me. I was asking something far more frightening. Who was the woman in that photograph? And why did she appear to be living a life Eleanor had never once mentioned? Before Eleanor, my life had become very orderly. That sounds better than saying it had become empty. I lived alone in a modest semi-detached house on the outskirts of York, in the same place Margaret and I had bought when Helen was still at primary school and James had only just learned to walk. The house was always tidy. I kept it that way because Margaret had. Her gardening gloves still hung from a hook in the utility room, stiff with old soil around the fingers. A half-used bottle of lavender hand cream remained beside the bathroom sink. I could never bring myself to throw it away. Sometimes, when I opened the cupboard beneath the stairs, I found one of her handwritten shopping lists tucked inside an old cookbook. Milk, potatoes, Tea bags. James's birthday card. Ordinary words in her handwriting could stop me more effectively than any photograph. There was one picture I kept on the mantelpiece. Margaret and me in Whitby. Standing near the harbor with the wind, making a complete mess of her hair. She was laughing at something I'd said. I no longer remembered what it was. That bothered me. Every morning I woke before 7. Though there was nowhere I urgently needed to be. After 46 years working as a railway signal engineer, my body still expected a timetable. I would switch on BBC Radio York, make 2 slices of toast and sit at the kitchen table while other people began their journeys to work. On Tuesdays, I went to the local library. I rarely borrowed more than 1 book, but I liked the quiet company of strangers. People turning pages, a librarian pushing a trolley, someone coughing politely in the history section. On Thursdays, I met Peter, a former colleague, at a garden centre cafe. We talked about old signaling boxes, rising prices, and the state of the railways, as though either of us had any power to change them. How are you managing? Then Peter would ask, perfectly, all right. I always said. It was the answer I gave everyone. Helen usually rang while driving home from work near Leeds. I could hear indicators clicking and traffic reports in the background. You sure you're eating properly? Dad, of course I am. James called between electrical jobs in Sheffield. His conversations often began with, I've only got 5 minutes. They both loved me. I knew that. Their lives were simply full. Mine was not. Most afternoons, I walked beside the Riveroos or found something unnecessary to repair. A loose cupboard handle, a gate latch that worked perfectly well, a shelf in the garage that had stood straight for 20 years. Small jobs gave my hands somewhere to go. The hardest time was Sunday evening. For 43 years, Sunday meant a roast dinner with Margaret. She liked the potatoes crisp enough to make a noise when you cut into them. Afterwards, we would have tea and disagree about what to watch on television. She preferred period dramas. I preferred anything involving facts, railways, or people answering questions under pressure. We always pretended the choice mattered. After she died, I still cooked on Sundays. 1 chicken breast, 1 potato, carrots, peas, and far too much broccoli. I never seemed able to judge portions for one person. Some part of me still prepared food, as if Margaret might walk in, place her handbag on the chair, and say, "You've made enough for the entire street." What I missed most was not romance. At 71, romance felt like something belonging to people who still bought new clothes for Friday nights. What I missed was being expected, being noticed, hearing someone say, "You're late." I was beginning to worry. Helen encouraged me to join a local walking group. I went once. Everyone was kind, but most had arrived as couples. They had shared jokes and matching flasks. I spent 2 hours walking beside a man called Colin who talked almost entirely about replacement hips. I did not return. James was the one who suggested the companionship website. People meet online now. Dad, it doesn't have to be serious. I'm not looking for a wife. I didn't say you were. I dismissed the idea. 2 weeks later, after another silent Sunday, I found the site on my laptop. I created a profile using a photograph from my granddaughter's birthday. In it, I was wearing a blue shirt and smiling because someone had just dropped a piece of cake. I wrote, "Retired railwayman. Widowed. Enjoys history. Coastal walks and honest conversation." I nearly deleted the whole thing. Then a message appeared. The sender was Eleanor Walsh. She had written, "You look like a man who has spent his life being dependable." I hope that does not sound too forward. I read it 3 times. Margaret had once called me dependable. No one else had used that word in years. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and began to type, never wondering how a complete stranger had found the exact thing I had been longing to hear. I replied with something cautious. "Thank you. That's very kind of you to say." Eleanor answered a few minutes later. "I meant it. Dependable people have a look about them. I smiled at that, though I also wondered whether it was the sort of thing she said to every man on the site. Her profile photograph showed a silver-haired woman with a gentle face and clear blue eyes. She was wearing a dark green cardigan, and behind her, I could see what looked like a garden in late summer. She said she was 68 and lived near Harrogate, a retired district nurse, widowed for 6 years, one daughter working overseas and a younger sister living in France. There was nothing flashy about her profile. No grand claims. No photographs taken beside expensive cars or on foreign beaches. She wrote that she missed ordinary conversation more than anything else. That felt honest. Our first messages were brief. She asked how long I had worked on the railways. I told her 46 years. Signal engineering. I added, expecting the conversation to end there. Instead, she replied, that must have required patience. One mistake, and somebody else pays for it. That caught my attention. Most people assumed railway work was simply trains and timetables. Eleanor seemed to understand responsibility. When I mentioned Margaret, she did not avoid the subject. She asked how long we had been married. 43 years. I wrote. Her reply came a minute later. You do not stop loving someone because they are no longer in the room. I sat back from the screen. It was such a simple sentence. Yet it reached somewhere. People had been carefully stepping around for 3 years. I read it again. Then I told her she was right. After that, we spoke every evening. Not romantically at first. We talked about the cost of heating, NHS waiting lists, and whether York had become too crowded in summer. She remembered old television dramas I had not thought about in years. We disagreed over the best fish and chips in Whitby. She preferred a place near the harbor. I told her the quieter shop further uphill was better. Then you'll have to prove it one day. She wrote. It was the first time she suggested there might be a future conversation outside the screen. I noticed it, but I did not allow myself to make too much of it. Her nursing stories made her feel real. She spoke about winter home visits, difficult staircases, and elderly patients who refused to admit they needed help. She knew the difference between ward routines and district work. She complained about paperwork. She described the smell of antiseptic on a cold morning and the silence in a family's house after someone had died. Nothing sounded rehearsed. Ons? I asked whether she missed nursing. Some parts. She replied, not the aching feet. Then, after a pause, she added, but I miss being useful. I understood that. Retirement can make a person feel as though the world has quietly stopped needing them. 10 days after her first message, Eleanor suggested a telephone call. I hesitated before agreeing. Messaging allowed time to think. A voice was more revealing. When she rang, her first words were, hello, David. I hope this isn't too strange. Her voice was warm, lower than I had expected, and slightly guarded. There was a faint accent I could not quite place. Not Yorkshire. Not entirely southern either. When I asked where she had grown up, she laughed. Everywhere. My father was in the military. We moved constantly. That explanation seemed reasonable. We spoke for nearly 2 hours. About Margaret. About her late husband. About old jobs. Bad knees, and the peculiar quiet that arrives after retirement. At one point, she made me laugh so suddenly that I startled myself. Before ending the call, she became quiet. I was nervous. She admitted, what about? That you might not sound like the man I imagined. And do I? No, she said. My heart dropped slightly. Then she continued, you sound safer. I carried that word with me for days. After that, I began taking my phone from room to room. I left it beside me while making tea. I checked it in the garden. I even took it upstairs while changing the bedding, in case I missed her call. When we arranged our first video chat, I bought a new shirt. Nothing expensive, just pale blue. Because Margaret used to say the color suited me. I cleaned the sitting room, though only one corner would appear on camera. At 7 o'clock, I sat waiting with my laptop open. At 5 past, a message arrived. I'm terribly sorry. The internet has gone again. Could we speak by voice instead? I felt disappointed, but not suspicious. Technology failed all the time. We rearranged for the following week. That call was canceled because Eleanor claimed her camera would not connect. The third time, she said her tablet had frozen during an update. Each excuse made sense on its own, and whenever I felt let down, she softened it with something intimate. That evening, she said quietly, "I wish I could reach through this phone and take your hand." I closed my eyes and imagined it. By then, I was no longer wondering whether I wanted to meet Eleanor. I was wondering how soon we could make it happen. Still, 3 video calls had been arranged, and 3 video calls had failed. How many reasonable excuses could one person have before they stopped being excuses and became a pattern over the next 4 months? Eleanor became woven into the smallest parts of my day. Her good morning message usually arrived before 8. Sometimes it was no more than, "Cold today. Wear a scarf." Other mornings, she sent a photograph of her tea beside a window and asked whether I had slept properly. I began answering before I had even turned on the radio. After dinner, we spoke for an hour or more. We listened to the same program on Radio 4 and sent messages whenever one of us disagreed with a guest. She reminded me about a dental appointment I had mentioned once and then forgotten. I reminded her about one of her own. "You're worse than a district nurse," she said. "You started it." It was domestic in a way I had not expected. We had never shared a room. Yet she knew when I was likely to be in the garden, when I usually made tea, and which evenings I found most difficult. One night, she asked about Margaret's final illness. I nearly changed the subject. Most people knew she had died after a long decline. Very few knew what happened on the last evening. I had been beside her hospital bed for almost 2 days. The nurses kept telling me to go home, shower, and rest. I refused until one of them said Margaret was settled and unlikely to wake for several hours. So I left. I was gone for less than 50 minutes. She died before I returned. For 3 years, I had carried the same thought. Perhaps she woke. Perhaps she looked towards the empty chair. Perhaps. After 43 years, the last thing she felt was that I had left her alone. I told Eleanor all of it. There was a long silence on the line. Then she spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had stood beside many hospital beds. "She would have known you were coming back." "I can't be certain of that. Patients know who has stayed beside them." "David. She would have felt safe because you had been there." I lowered my head. No one had ever said that to me. Not the doctor. Not my children. Not even the bereavement counselor I saw twice and then stopped visiting. After we ended the call, I sat in the dark and wept quietly. From that evening, I trusted Eleanor in a way that felt complete. She had not removed my guilt. Exactly. But she had given it somewhere softer to rest. A few days later, she began telling me about her own marriage. Her husband, she said, had controlled all their finances. She had earned a nurse's salary for decades, but rarely knew what was in their accounts. After his death, she discovered debts he had never mentioned. "I felt such a fool," she admitted. "You trusted your husband. That doesn't make it easier." She said money still embarrassed her. Even discussing bills made her anxious. At the time, I thought she was sharing a painful truth. Later, I understood that she was preparing me to explain away everything that followed. I eventually told Helen and James that I had met someone online. Helen sounded pleased, though cautious. "That's lovely." "Dad, what's she like?" "Kind. Sensible. A retired nurse." James was less delicate. "Have you seen her properly on video?" "Not properly." "Met here?" "Not yet." "Do you know her address?" "She lives near Harrogate." "That isn't an address." I felt my patience thinning. She spent her life in the NHS. "James. She understands people. Anyone can say they were a nurse." The conversation ended badly. I accused him of looking for danger where none existed. He told me he was only asking the questions I should have been asking myself. For several days afterwards, I did not mention Eleanor to either of them. Then a parcel arrived. Inside was a second-hand book about British railway history. The sort filled with old photographs of signal boxes and junction diagrams. There was a small sprig of dried lavender tied with string and a handwritten card. For the man who has made my world feel inhabited again. I read the sentence twice. Then I placed the card beside Margaret's photograph. Immediately, guilt rose in me. The two women seemed to occupy the same small space on the mantelpiece. That evening, I told Eleanor I felt disloyal. She answered gently, "Margaret loved you. Why would she want love to end with her?" I wanted to believe that. Soon afterwards, we arranged to meet at Betty's in Harrogate. I arrived early and waited near the entrance. 20 minutes before our meeting, Eleanor rang to say her sister had been taken ill. She sounded shaken. I went home disappointed, but concerned for her. Our second meeting was arranged in York. That morning, she canceled again. She claimed she had been exposed to influenza and did not want to risk passing it to me. Instead of feeling suspicious, I felt cared for. She began speaking more confidently about our future. Walks along the Yorkshire coast. Christmas together. Perhaps even a week in Whitby. One afternoon, I cleared half the wardrobe in the spare bedroom. Margaret's clothes had remained there since she died. I folded each item carefully and placed it into storage boxes. It felt like opening a door I had kept locked for years. That evening, as I stood looking at the empty side of the wardrobe, my phone vibrated. Eleanor's message was short and frightened. "Caroline has had a serious accident in France. I have to leave tonight." I sat down on the edge of the bed. Until then, Eleanor had asked me for nothing except time and trust. But as I read her message, I felt that something was about to change. Was I being given the chance to prove my love? Or had everything I had confessed helped someone build the perfect trap? Eleanor traveled to France the following morning. At least, that was what she told me. His sister, Caroline, had been taken to hospital after a serious road accident. Eleanor said the doctors were concerned about internal injuries and that she had booked the first flight she could find. For the first 2 days, her messages were brief. Still waiting for news. "I'm sorry, David. I can barely think." I did not question her. I remembered hospital corridors. Vending machine coffee. The strange way time slows when somebody you love is lying behind a closed door. On the third evening, she called. The line was poor, and her voice kept fading in and out. "Where are you?" I asked. "In the corridor. The signal's dreadful." "Which hospital is it?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Edouard Herriot. In Lyon." I wrote the name on the back of an envelope so I would remember it. A few days later, while telling me about Caroline's solicitor, she said, "Everything here in Marseille has become so complicated." I frowned. "I thought you were in Lyon." There was a pause. "We were." "They transferred her." "To Marseille." "Yes. The specialist she needs is here." It was possible. People were transferred between hospitals all the time. Still, something small and uncomfortable remained after the call. Her messages changed as well. They began arriving at odd hours. Sometimes I woke at 3 in the morning and found a long paragraph from her waiting on my phone. When I asked why she was awake, she said stress had ruined her sleep. The wording became stranger too. One message ended with, "I await your positive response." I laughed when I read it. "You sound like a bank manager." I told her later. She did not laugh. "I'm sorry, my English no longer meets your standards." "That isn't what I meant. I'm exhausted." "David." Her voice had turned cold in a way I had never heard before. I apologized, though I was not entirely sure what I had done wrong. An hour later, she sent another message. "Forgive me. I'm frightened and tired." The warmth returned, and I felt guilty for upsetting her. During calls, I often heard noise in the background. Several voices speaking at once. Doors opening. A television. Perhaps. Once. A man laughed close to the phone. "Who was that?" I asked. "Caroline's solicitor. He sounds cheerful." He was speaking to someone else. Again. The explanation was reasonable. That was the difficulty. Nothing was impossible. Each concern could be dismissed on its own. It was only when placed beside the others that a pattern began to form. Then Eleanor sent a photograph. She said it had been taken outside the hospital after a difficult meeting with the doctors. She looked tired, but composed. Wearing a light coat and holding a paper cup. Helen visited the next afternoon. I showed her the picture, expecting sympathy. Instead, she enlarged it on my phone. Dad, look at the trees. What about them? They're in full leaf. So, it's the end of November. I stared at the background. The trees were deep green. People behind Eleanor wore short sleeves. It may have been taken earlier. I said. Then why did she make it sound as though it was taken yesterday? She didn't say yesterday exactly. Helen handed the phone back. She did not argue. That somehow made me more defensive. A week later, Helen offered to help arrange a proper video call. Eleanor agreed, though she sounded uneasy. At 7 o'clock, Helen and I sat together in my sitting room with the laptop open. The call connected. A woman appeared on screen. Silver hair. Boniface. The same woman from the photographs. But the image was blurred and almost completely still. Her mouth barely moved. Hello, David. A voice said. The screen froze. 12 seconds later, the call ended. A message arrived immediately. Hospital Wi-Fi. I am so embarrassed. Helen remained quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dad, I think that may have been a recording. I felt heat rise into my face. You saw her. I saw an image. You've decided she's lying before giving her any chance. I'm trying to protect you. No. You don't want anything to change. Helen looked confused. What does that mean? You were comfortable when I was alone. You didn't have to make room for anyone new. Her expression changed. I knew I had hurt her. But I was too angry to stop. She picked up her coat. I have never wanted you to be lonely. The front door closed quietly behind her. A few minutes later, Eleanor messaged. I told her what had happened. Her reply came almost at once. I fear your family will never accept us. Perhaps we must decide whether our future belongs to them or to us. I sat alone with those words for a long time. My daughter had spent years loving me without asking for anything. Eleanor had spent months making me feel alive again. And for the first time, I felt I was being asked to choose between them. Would I protect the trust of my children, or the woman who had filled the silence they could not see? For 2 days after Helen left, I heard very little from Eleanor. Her replies were shorter than usual. When I asked whether Caroline was improving, she wrote, The situation is complicated. That was all. On the third evening, she rang. Her voice sounded weak. David, I'm so ashamed. What's happened? I don't want to ask you for anything. The sentence made my stomach tighten before she had even explained. She said her purse had been stolen outside the hospital. Her passport was gone. Her bank had frozen her accounts after several suspicious attempts to access them. She had no money for the hotel, medication, or transport. How much do you need? I asked. No. Please forget I said anything. Eleanor, I'll find another way. What other way? She went quiet. Then she said, almost in a whisper, about 1,250 pounds. It was not a small amount, but it was not beyond me. Margaret and I had always saved carefully. I still had an ISA, a pension, and enough put aside for repairs to the house. Even so, I hesitated. Eleanor noticed. Don't send it if you feel uncomfortable. She said quickly, I would rather sleep at the hospital than make you doubt me. That reassured me more than any promise could have done. A person trying to exploit me, I thought, would surely push harder. I'll transfer it, I said. She began to cry. Not dramatically, just enough to make me feel I had done something decent. The money went through the next morning. Within minutes, Eleanor's warmth returned. My dearest man, she wrote, you have shown me what it feels like to be cared for without being controlled. I read that message several times. It made me feel proud, useful, Needed. She promised to repay me as soon as the bank lifted the restrictions. 3 days later, there was another problem. A solicitor needed £2,800 to prepare documents connected to Caroline's insurance claim. Eleanor sent me a letter on headed paper. It looked official. There was a company name, a reference number, and a signature at the bottom. I transferred the money. Then came a temporary tax charge. £4,500. This time, she sent a bank notice, a hospital invoice, and a scanned page from her passport. I examined them, but only in the way a trusting person examines proof. I was looking for reassurance, not faults. Had I looked properly, I might have noticed that one date was written in a different format, that the solicitor's name appeared with 2 spellings, that the passport number was partly obscured. Instead, I saw what I wanted to see. Evidence that Eleanor was real. Evidence that she was in trouble. Evidence that helping her was an act of love. To cover the next payment, I withdrew money from my ISA. At the bank, a member of staff asked me to take a seat. She was young, perhaps 30, and spoke very carefully. "Mr. Mercer, can I ask who the payment is for?" "Personal expenses." "Is it for a family member? Someone close to me?" "Have you met the recipient in person?" I felt myself stiffen. "No." "But that isn't relevant. I'm only asking because the amount and destination have triggered a warning." "She's a retired NHS nurse." The woman nodded. "Have you independently verified that?" I heard caution in her voice, but it felt like condescension. "I am 71. Not 7. I understand." "No, I don't think you do." She delayed the transfer and handed me a fraud warning leaflet. Outside the branch, I dropped it into a bin without reading it. When I told Eleanor, she was furious on my behalf. "They humiliated you. They were doing their job. They treated you as though you were incapable of making a decision." That was exactly how it had felt. She understood the insult before I had even found the words for it. From then on, every warning began to look like an attack on my independence. Helen's questions, James's suspicion, the bank's concern. All of it could be dismissed as younger people assuming they knew better. By the time Eleanor asked for £9,000, I no longer saw myself as sending money to a stranger. I saw myself as standing by the woman I loved when everyone else had abandoned her. I made the transfer. That evening, she sent a message full of relief. "I will be back in England within 48 hours. Then, no more screens. No more waiting." I cleared my diary, bought fresh flowers, changed the bedding in the spare room. 48 hours passed. Then another day. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her messages remained unread. I sat at the kitchen table, checking the screen again and again, while the flowers slowly began to droop. Had something happened to Eleanor, or had I finally sent my savings to someone who had never intended to come home? Helen came round on the 4th day. I had ignored 2 of her calls and let a 3rd ring until it stopped. I did not want to explain why the flowers in the kitchen were dying or why I had been wearing the same jumper since Tuesday. She let herself in with the spare key. "Dad." I was sitting at the table with my phone in front of me. Eleanor's last message still showed, beneath the time. "I will be back in England within 48 hours. Helen looked at me, then at the unopened post beside my elbow. "You look dreadful." "I'm tired." "Have you eaten?" "I'm not a child." "I didn't say you were." She took off her coat and sat opposite me. A letter from the bank had fallen partly open. I saw her eyes move towards the figures before I could cover it. "Dad, what are these withdrawals?" I folded the letter. "Private." "Is this about Eleanor?" "She's in difficulty." "How much have you sent?" I stood and carried my untouched mug to the sink. "That is none of your concern." Helen did not follow me or raise her voice. She remained at the table and waited until I looked back. Then she asked one question. "Dad, has Eleanor ever stood in the same room as you?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Helen lowered her eyes. A few hours later, James arrived from Sheffield. He came in too quickly, still wearing his work clothes, anger covering the fear on his face. "She's a criminal," He said, "You don't know that. She's taken thousands from you. She borrowed money from a man she refuses to meet. Get out." "Dad, listen to yourself." I said get out. Then James said the one thing he should not have said. Mom would never have wanted this. The kitchen seemed to shrink around us. I turned towards him slowly. "Do not use your mother against me." "I didn't mean. You have no right. I'm frightened for you." "No. You're embarrassed by me." James's face changed immediately. The anger left it. "I'm sorry." But the words had already done their damage. Helen stepped between us. "No one is questioning whether your feelings were real," she said. I laughed bitterly. "That appears to be exactly what you're doing." "No. Dad. Even if she lied. You didn't. What you felt was honest." That stopped me. It was the first thing either of them had said that did not make me feel foolish. Helen reached for my phone but did not take it. "Will you let me look at one photograph?" I hesitated, then unlocked the screen. She chose the clearest image of Eleanor and used a search tool on her laptop. We waited. Several results appeared. A nursing charity, a campaign about retired NHS staff. The same silver-haired woman smiled from the page. Underneath was a name. Margaret Ellis, not Eleanor Walsh. The article said she was a retired nurse from Kent. It also mentioned her husband, alive. I shook my head. That could be an old surname. Dad. Perhaps she changed her identity after her marriage. Why would she lie about where she lives? She told me her husband was controlling. Maybe there are things she cannot put online. I called Eleanor. Voicemail. Again. Nothing. Then, a message appeared. "Please do not trust what your children show you. They do not understand our situation." My heart leapt at the sight of her words. She explained that Eleanor Walsh was not the name she had used during her marriage. She had changed her identity after escaping abuse. Public records, she said, could not show the truth. I read the message aloud. James swore under his breath. Helen looked heartbroken. I wanted Eleanor's explanation to be true so badly that wanting became a kind of belief. Then several documents arrived. A solicitor's letter. A statement about Caroline's frozen estate. Figures showing an inheritance of nearly £400,000. Eleanor said $38,000 was needed to release it. After that, she would return to Yorkshire and repay every penny. "This is the last thing I will ever ask of you." She added that unpaid legal charges might lead to her arrest. I imagined her alone in a foreign country, frightened and depending on me. Helen read the figure and went pale. "Please don't do this. You don't understand. I understand that she is asking you for nearly everything you have left. She'll repay it. Dad, please." I pointed towards the hallway. "I want you both to leave." James started to argue, but Helen touched his arm. They put on their coats. At the door, she turned back. "We love you, even if you're angry with us." Then they were gone. The house fell silent. That night, rain began tapping against the conservatory roof. I sat alone at the kitchen table and opened my banking app. The payment details were already entered. £38,000. My finger hovered above the confirmation button. Would I choose the evidence my children had placed in front of me, or the voice that had filled 9 months of silence? I read Eleanor's final message again. "This is the last thing I will ever ask of you. After tomorrow, we can finally be together." Then my eyes dropped to the last line. "Please trust me, Danielle." For several seconds, I simply stared at the name. Danielle. I typed back at once. "Who is Daniel?" The reply came quickly. "What do you mean? You called me Daniel." There was a pause. Then, "I am exhausted. David. I have barely slept. Please do not turn one small mistake into something cruel." That should have reassured me. Instead, it made the room feel colder. I looked again at the document she had sent. The solicitor's letter. The inheritance statement. The warning about unpaid legal charges. This time, I did not read them as a man trying to help someone he loved. I read them as an engineer looking for faults. One date was written as day, month, year. Another used the American order. The solicitor's name appeared in two different fonts. The address at the bottom of the letter did not match the company's website. I checked it twice. Then Helen rang. I nearly ignored her. When I answered, she did not ask whether I had sent the money. She said, "Dad, the woman from the charity has agreed to speak to you." What woman? The real woman in the photographs. My first instinct was to refuse. I did not want another piece of evidence. I had enough already. But somewhere between Daniel's name and the false address, something inside me had shifted. "All right," I said. 10 minutes later, Helen sent a video link. I opened it at the kitchen table. A silver-haired woman appeared clearly on screen. The same face I had looked at every morning for 9 months. The same smile. The same eyes. But when she spoke, the voice was completely different. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Margaret Ellis." I felt my stomach drop. She explained that she was a retired nurse from Kent. Her photographs had been taken from charity websites and social media. Several men had contacted her over the years after losing money to someone using her face. One gentleman believed we were engaged, she said quietly. Another had sold part of his pension investments. Margaret apologized. That was the strangest part. She had done nothing wrong. Yet she looked ashamed on behalf of people she had never met. "Have you ever used the name Eleanor Walsh?" I asked. "No." "Lived near Harrogate?" "No." "Had a sister called Caroline in France?" She shook her head. I closed the laptop. For a long time, I could hear only the rain. The following morning, Detective Constable Aisha Rahman came to the house with Helen. She did not speak to me as though I were confused or incapable. She asked permission before looking at my phone. She read the messages carefully. After an hour, she said, "We have seen parts of this story before. The injured sister, the frozen bank account, the legal fees, even the inheritance. At least 4 other men had received messages from someone using the same identity. One of them, she believed, was probably Daniel. The words I had thought were private had been adapted and sent to others. The handwritten card had likely been produced by a printer designed to imitate handwriting. Even the dried lavender was not personal. It was part of a package used to deepen trust. I felt physically sick. Every intimate moment seemed contaminated. Margaret's final night, my guilt, my loneliness, all of it had been gathered, recorded and turned into a method. I looked at Helen. How could I have been so stupid? She moved her chair closer. "You were lonely." "Dad, that is not the same as being stupid." Under Aisha's guidance, I continued messaging Eleanor. I wrote that the money was ready, but I needed one live video call first. She avoided the request. Then the tone changed. The warmth disappeared. "Why are you delaying? Do you want me to be arrested? After everything I have given you emotionally, you are abandoning me over money." I read that final sentence twice. For 9 months, love had been offered as comfort. Now it was being used as a weapon. I typed one last reply. A person who loved me would not require me to purchase their safety. The message showed as delivered. Then the account vanished. The photographs disappeared. The profile was gone. So, was the woman I had believed I knew? There was no apology, no explanation, only silence. But one payment route had already been traced by the police. And for the first time since this began, I was no longer asking whether Eleanor would come back. I was asking whether the people behind her could finally be found. The bank began its investigation the following morning. Detective Constable Rahman had already contacted their fraud team. And by 9:30, I was sitting in a small office above the branch where I had once thrown their warning leaflet into a bin. The same employee who had questioned the earlier transfer brought me a glass of water. She did not say, "I told you so." That kindness made the whole thing harder. A fraud specialist went through each payment with me. The first £1,250, then $2,800, $4,500, $9,000. He asked where the money had gone, what Eleanor had told me, and whether I still had copies of the documents. I handed over everything. The solicitor's letters, the hospital invoice, the passport page, every piece of proof I had once used to defend her. Most of the money had already passed through several accounts. Some had left Britain. Some had been converted and moved again before anyone could intervene. There was no simple way to bring it all back. However, one recent transfer was still being held in a UK account linked to the investigation. The bank managed to freeze it before it could be moved. I recovered part of what I had lost. Not enough to erase the damage. Enough to stop the loss becoming complete. The £38,000 payment had never been confirmed. That one fact saved my home. Most of my remaining savings and the independence I had spent my working life protecting a daughter's. Aisha was careful not to offer false hope. The people organizing this may be overseas. She told me, these investigations can take time. A man in Birmingham had allowed money to pass through his account. He was arrested. Further evidence connected the account to other victims and to a larger network operating abroad. The main people behind Eleanor were not caught immediately. I had imagined justice as a door being kicked open and one guilty face appearing behind it. The reality was slower. Bank records, statements, account numbers, a partial arrest, a frozen payment. Justice was incomplete. But it was real. I gave a formal statement that lasted nearly 4 hours. The officer read portions of my own messages back to me. I wanted to ask him to stop. Instead, I answered every question. Lauder. Aisha asked whether my case could be used anonymously in a fraud awareness campaign. My first reaction was no. I did not want strangers knowing what I had done, even without my name. I imagined people listening and thinking, how could any sensible man believe that? A few weeks later, Helen mentioned a support meeting. I'm not going. You don't have to speak. I don't want to sit in a room full of people feeling sorry for me. No one will. In the end, she drove me there. She waited outside in the cafe while I went in alone. There were 9 people in the room. A retired head teacher, a former accountant, a widower who had served in the police, a woman who believed she was helping a military doctor return home. None of them looked foolish. They looked tired, ashamed, ordinary, unbewan. They told stories that sounded painfully familiar. Daily messages, missed meetings, emergencies, money, promises. I realized intelligence had not protected any of us because the fraud had not begun with figures. It had begun with attention. That evening, James came round for several minutes. Neither of us mentioned what had happened. Then I said, I'm sorry I ordered you out. He stared into his tea. I'm sorry I brought Mum into it. You were frightened. So are you? We sat quietly. Then James admitted something I had never known. After Margaret died, he had avoided visiting because the house was too painful. Every room reminded him of her. I thought you wanted space. He said, I thought you were too busy. We had all been grieving separately and mistaking silence for strength. When the bank finally rang to confirm that the £38,000 had never left my account, I sat down before my legs could give way. I had lost a significant amount. I could not pretend otherwise. But I still had my home. I still had enough to live on. And, despite everything I had said to them, I still had my children. The financial danger was over. Yet every evening, I avoided the chair where I had once spoken to Eleanor. The room remained untouched after dark. I could understand how to protect an account. What I could not understand was how to protect a heart without closing it completely. How does a person learn to trust again when the happiest months of his new life were built on a lie? Several months passed before I could sit in the conservatory after dark without thinking about Eleanor. At first, I avoided the room entirely in the evenings. That had been our time. 7:30. A cup of tea. The small lamp beside my chair, and her voice filling the silence. Once the truth came out, the room seemed to hold every conversation at once. So, I changed my routine. I began volunteering one morning a week at the National Railway Museum. The first day, I nearly turned around at the entrance. I had spent so long making excuses not to be among people that even a room full of visitors felt exhausting. Then, a schoolboy pointed towards an old signaling display and asked me what it did. I explained. He asked another question, then 3 more. Before I knew it, I had spent 20 minutes describing how signals once protected trains from mistakes no passenger would ever see. It felt good to be useful again. Not admired. Not needed. Desperately. Simply useful. I also joined a local bereavement walking group. There were no promises of friendship or romance. We met near the river, walked at an ordinary pace, and spoke when we felt like it. Some people talked about their spouses. Others discussed the weather, arthritis, or where to find a decent cup of tea. The lack of pressure was a relief. For once, nobody seemed to be searching for the perfect words. A few months later, Margaret Ellis contacted me. The real Margaret. The retired nurse whose photographs had been stolen. She had been invited to take part in an online fraud awareness event and asked whether I would speak with her. My first answer was no. Then I remembered the support meeting. How relieved I had felt when I realized I was not the only person this had happened to. So I agreed. During the event, Margaret explained what it was like to see her own face attached to false promises. She said victims sometimes contacted her angry, believing she had betrayed them. Others apologized as though they had done something wrong. When it was my turn, I spoke about the messages, the money, and the way loneliness had made attention feel like proof. At the end, Margaret looked into the camera and said something I have never forgotten. The people who did this borrowed my face, David, but they used your goodness. That goodness still belongs to you. For a moment, I could not answer. I had spent months treating my ability to trust as evidence of weakness. Margaret saw it differently. The criminals had not created my kindness. They had only found a way to misuse it. That Sunday, Helen and James came to the house with their families. The kitchen was far too crowded. There were coats on the banister, toys beneath the table, and more plates than I had room for. James burnt the Yorkshire puddings. Helen told him they looked like roof tiles. The grandchildren laughed until one of them knocked over a glass of water. Years earlier, the noise might have tired me. After Eleanor, it sounded like safety. When everyone had finished eating, Helen stayed behind to help with the washing up. She handed me a tea towel and asked, "Do you regret joining that site?" I thought about it carefully. I regret sending the money. Of course. I regret ignoring you. She gave me a look. You were fairly unpleasant. I know. Then I said, but I don't regret learning that I'm still capable of caring about someone. Helen stopped drying the plate in her hands. I'm glad. So was I. Being deceived did not mean the feelings I had offered were false. My affection had been real. My concern had been real. My hope had been real. Someone had seen my loneliness and chosen to exploit it. But the shame of that choice belonged to them, not to me. I had also learned that independence does not mean handling every danger alone. For most of my life, I believed dignity meant solving my own problems and keeping worry away from my children. Now I understand that sometimes dignity begins with 3 words. I need help. I still have Eleanor's card. For the man who has made my world feel inhabited again. I keep it in a drawer now, not as a memory of love, as a warning about how easily loneliness can make imitation feel genuine. That evening, after Helen and James had gathered their coats, I placed the card back in the drawer and closed it. From the kitchen came laughter. Someone was arguing about whether the Yorkshire puddings were burnt or merely well done. I stood there for a moment, listening. Then I walked back towards my family. Trust had been broken, but closing my heart forever would not have repaired it. Perhaps learning to trust more slowly, more openly, and with the people who love me beside me, was the bravest recovery I could make.